Hello, my name is Hannah. This is my podcast for my English 101 public remediation project, and my topic is police officers in schools. So, to get started, a little bit of history. In the early 1990s, the United States government attempted to curb gun violence and drug use, specifically in schools. So, they made the minimum punishment for any student committing these offenses to be 1 year kicked out of school. So the idea was that the punishment was so severe that no student would possibly risk committing such an offense. While they couldn't necessarily force schools to abide by these policies, they could threaten to withhold or decrease funding for the schools if they refused to comply. So essentially, the schools had no choice. They were pretty much forced into it. There was no way around it. These zero tolerance policies were everywhere. And while it was good in theory, trying to reduce the number of gun violence and drug use incidences, my bad, it very much backfired. The suspension and expulsion rates all across the United States, everywhere, just absolutely skyrocketed. And it was kind of, very much the opposite of what they were expecting. And it wasn't because students were committing more offenses, but rather they're committing the same amount of offenses as before, but the schools were now cracking down on them much more harshly and much more often. So with the alarming increase in rates of expulsion and suspension and punishment and everything, some schools kind of panicked, and a few of them, mostly okay, hold on, sorry, let me take a step back. Some schools had so many of these issues that they felt they needed, more help controlling them. So a lot of them instated actual police. But the catch is, like, a very, very large majority of the schools who decided to instate police were very much underfunded and in majority Black neighborhoods. So police officers are not often in schools where the student body is mostly white. So this issue that I'm going to tell you about mostly affects students of color. What's a little sneaky is that, these were real police officers, but they went under the much less threatening title in school as SROs, school resource officers. So, no one would think much of a school resource officer in terms of being able to punish students. But keep in mind, these are regular police, and they, like other police, they have the power to arrest, even though you wouldn't think they'd need to, because the demographic of people they're supposedly policing is mostly minors. Like, it's literally elementary school to high school. However, that is exactly what happened. Children of all ages, and they just started getting arrested. And keep in mind, like I said earlier, the large majority of schools that had these police officers doing the arresting were made up of mostly Black students. So the Black students were disproportionately being punished and arrested compared to their white counterparts. Over the years, there have been numerous studies on, the relationship between race and behavior. And there has been no evidence to suggest that Black students are any more likely than white students to misbehave. But here's where things start to pick up and get a little bit interesting. So, given that there is no evidence at all to suggest that Black students are more likely to misbehave than white students or commit these offenses more than white students, but statistically speaking, after these zero tolerance policies were passed and police officers were instated in schools, Black students were arrested at a rate 3 times higher than white students. And I know that, the schools with police officers were mainly made up of Black students, so you'd think it would make sense if everyone's being arrested equally. If there are 3 times more Black students, they would be arrested at a 3-fold proportion as white students, because that's just how ratios work. But this is not the case. It's within. So I'm going to attempt to do some math here in an effort to further convey what I'm trying to say, because I feel like I'm doing a bad job. So Imagine, we know that the students who are in schools that have police officers are mostly black. Like the population of students overall of who have police in their schools are mostly black. So let's say the ratio is throughout all the schools 3 to 1. There are 3 black students for every 1 white student. And considering, theoretically, because there's no difference in rates of misbehavior among students of different races, if the rates were equal, because there are more black students, 3 times more black students, they would be 3 times more black students arrested, just because that's how proportions work. But it's not even that. It's proportional. So of those 3 times as many students, they are 3 times themselves more likely to be arrested. So that means that even if the ratio of students, of black students to white students, is 3 to 1, keeping in mind that black people are arrested at rates 3 times higher, that means of the people arrested, the ratio would be 9 to 1 in terms of black students to white students, because it's 3 times as likely to be arrested for black students, which is completely disproportionate. So obviously, this raises some questions. And, people have thought this and they've done some research, and there have been a few findings that are questionable. Well, not questionable, but I mean, they have found that the police officers are doing some questionable things, to put it nicely. So there was one study that found that of students arrested, when it was a white student, they were more likely to be arrested for something that was provable, that there was evidence of, and, it was like a more intense crime, like vandalism or something, versus of the black students who were arrested, it was usually subjective and there was no actual crime. Like the example the study gave was that students who were black would be arrested for disrespect. I'm not joking. That was the reason. They said disrespect. So I think any sane, reasonable person who is in touch with reality would be able to safely recognize that that is racism. The police are being racist. So there are two sort of, there may be more, but the ones I'm thinking of, the two sort of subcategories of racism, specifically in America, are on a systemic level, like the legal system, and then on an individual level. So on the systemic level, let's go back in history for a second. Once the amendment was passed outlawing holding black people as slaves, there was no longer legal standing to be able to do this, and all the slave owners were pissed. But, they found ways to kind of get around it. Like, you could not explicitly create laws that were racist. So they would be discreet, and they would do things like, because when black people were enslaved, they didn't have the opportunity to go to school. So after they were freed, lawmakers were like, let's require a literacy test in order to vote, because they knew that these black people who hadn't gone to school wouldn't pass the literacy test. So it was essentially, it's voter suppression and it's racism, but it's like discreet and technically legal. And that was way back in history. And still today, it's similar things. Racism is not diminishing, it is just evolving. As for a present day example, so we have the racial wealth gap. And it's obviously not because black people don't do as much work as white people, but rather because in our capitalistic society, essentially the only way to get ahead is to be fortunate enough to have generational wealth. And the black people in this country, literally, most of them descended from slaves. So they were set back from the very beginning. It was so ridiculously stacked against them. So there's a lot fewer cases of significant generational wealth among black families compared to white families. And this permeates into housing because, housing affordability by area, houses relatively cost similar or close to the houses around it, like in the same neighborhood areas, whatever. And, with the racial wealth gap and black people being significantly disadvantaged, there's the whole issue of gentrification. So I'm going to do my best to explain it in layman's terms, I suppose. So let's say, you know, there's a community of people living together, and slowly, housing contractors or whatever they're called, the people who build the houses, I don't know, city planners, start investing in the area to make it more appealing. So then wealthier people, usually wealthier white families, will want to move in. And as wealthier people move in, more people want to move in, the houses become higher in demand. And, economics, the more something is in demand, the higher the prices go up. And the black people who are already living there couldn't keep up because like I said, the racial wealth gap. So they would essentially be pushed out of their own neighborhoods. And this is called gentrification. But the point is that this happens a lot. So then usually the displaced families sometimes end up around the same area. And so that's how we have these communities that are like almost uniformly black, for example. And here comes zoning laws. I know this is kind of all over the place, but I promise you it will make sense. Okay, zoning laws. It's how the government, defines zones and like where to put certain things for the city, what to invest in, planning, like spatially, monetary stuff, the whole deal. Like it's like counties, zoning laws. And these zoning laws also determine which school you go to, for public school at least. Private school is a different story. But so zoning laws are for the purpose of the benefit of the city itself. So they're going to do what makes the most money, even if it's not necessarily humane or ethical or good for the people. So they would put all the things that they would put the better resources and whatever. And for example, the better schools, they would invest much more in the schools in wealthier, whiter areas. So then black students were mostly at underfunded, under-resourced schools because that's the zones they were in. And these were the schools with the police. So you see, it's not explicit legal racism, but like it is there. It is very much there. So that's how, it's still happening today, just in a more modern fashion. So we've established this. And then also, I said a while ago that there's kind of two-ish groups of racism that I'm going to be talking about. The other one is on the individual level, implicit bias. So we live in a racist society. If you disagree, I have some news for you, bestie. You're wrong, and do some research. But it's because of this, there's implicit bias ingrained in us, essentially from the moment we're born, because, if you grow up in a society that's racist and has racist objectives and values and, subtle and even overt racist messages, you will internalize that. And it's not necessarily your fault, like babies are not born racist, but it is undeniable that it is there. And everyone has this. And this is where it can mess with people because people who are in positions of authority, like the police, certainly also have racial bias. So that's going to affect how they police the children. So these two factors, along with others, this is certainly a non-exhaustive list, but these are the things that are the reasoning and the explanation behind why black students are being disproportionately punished when there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that they actually misbehave more. It's racism. So given that, it's important to note that students who are arrested or suspended or expelled, any of those things, once it happens once, the percentage of likelihood that they become a repeat offender is incredibly high. Like it is much, much higher. And there's some psychological term for this, and I learned about it in my criminal justice class, and